In 2020, the film SCOOB was released with a very different voice cast than what fans were used to. Frank Welker had been voicing Fred Jones for over 50 years, and here's Zac Efron in the role. Matthew Lillard, a star himself, had been voicing Shaggy for around a decade, and here's Will Forte for some reason.
Don't worry, bro. Cleo will never take your place as my best friend.
I want The Rock to play me.
Never gonna happen.
But this wasn't the first time a theatrical Hanna-Barbera film saw a studio meddling with a legacy voice cast leading to an inferior product. Let's get into the infamous time Jetsons the movie recast Judy for what would be a troubled and doomed production that saw death, and even a legendary voice director asked to have her name removed. The Jetsons was an animated series produced by Hanna-Barbera Productions starting from 1962 to 1963, following a family in the futuristic space age. Needing more episodes for syndication a couple of decades later, a revival would air in 1985 and 1987.
Because it had built a real following with the kids, Hanna-Barbera thought, why not bring it back?
All voice actors from the original series would return, and legendary, now retired voice director Andrea Romano would join as casting director, where she got to work with all of them.
I was just a baby casting director. I was only beginning as a casting director then. And I remember thinking, how positively thrilling to work on such a classic cartoon.
Andrea Romano was assistant to Gordon Hunt, and then later on, Gordon turned everything over to her, and she did all of the direction for the voice people.
So we went back to all the actors that had worked on the series originally to try to see if they wanted to come back and play.
And these people who had gone many, many years since the original one came back, and they sounded as good, if not better, than they did in the original.
It was such fun to get back into it. We loved each other. The cast all adored each other.
You could see that when they got back together after 20 years of not seeing each other, it really was like a family reunion.
These were all people who had, 20 years later, and they were probably in their 50s and 60s when they did the show originally. But their voices and their attitude and their acting was just as good and just as lively and just as energetic as it had been before.
The Jetsons really touched people and made them have fun.
During this period, Universal would purchase the film rights to the franchise, and a theatrical animated film directed by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera was put into production. Early on, one thing became obvious. The older age and poor health of some of the legendary voice actors returning yet again was becoming an issue. According to Romano, Penny Singleton, voice of Jane Jetson, George's wife, had gotten dentures by this point which would click, and had a hard time manipulating her lips and tongue around them for clear enough articulation, so co-star Dawes Butler had to start teaching her how to work with them better. Butler, who was the iconic voice of Elroy Jetson, George's son, suffered a stroke along with pneumonia, which would lead to his death in 1988 before any voice acting could be done. Despite Butler having trained successors like Greg Burson, voice coordinator Chris Zimmerman brought in her husband, Patrick Zimmerman, to take on the voice of Elroy instead. He was mostly unknown at the time, though he's become a fairly recognizable name since. George O'Hanlon, voice of, well, George, was one of the people looking most forward to the film.
It's time for the Jetson traffic beater. Inflate-a-cop.
However, now 77, he had suffered a stroke by this point and as a result was partially blind along with some mobility issues, so he had to have his lines read to him one at a time by recording director Gordon Hunt to be able to deliver them, in addition to having to be separate from the rest of the cast. To put it bluntly, he was described as not well at the time. Unfortunately, Andrea Romano, who had also joined the crew on the movie, would experience an event that would haunt her when O'Hanlon's declining health would catch up to him. In her interview with Nancy Cartwright, she would reveal what happened. These are her words. George said, "Andrea, come over and put your ear next to my head." So I did, and I could actually hear the blood pulsing through his skull. I could actually hear every heartbeat. I said, "George, how do you hear anything?" He said, "It's really getting hard to hear you guys speak to me." As we got through the session, we never tried to record him longer than an hour because we knew it was taxing. We could see him getting paler and paler, and I looked at Gordon, who said, "Let's just stop for today and we'll bring you back in next week when you're feeling better." So we called his wife, Nancy, from the office, and suddenly his head just pitched forward onto her chest, and I saw this look pass between her and Gordon, and I knew that something very bad had just happened. I instantly called 911. The paramedics were at Hanna-Barbera in 3 minutes to whisk him away to the hospital. We followed him in our car, but he had died. They put him on life support in the ambulance, but George O'Hanlon really died in the recording session doing what he loved.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but, well, yes, maybe I would.
Voice actor Jeff Bergman would be brought in to finish the dialogue O'Hanlon hadn't been able to.
Sure, Elroy. I wouldn't miss it for the universe.
Love you, Judy. That's nice, dear.
Hey, I thought you'd be happy. You all know how long I've wanted to get a promotion. And besides, I'm doing it all for you, my family.
Prolific legend Mel Blanc had returned to voice George's boss, Mr. Spacely.
This plant will produce Spacely sprockets and spindles at 1/10 of what it costs down here.
But due to his own age and poor health, he passed away during the middle of production only 5 months later, and had to have his role finished by Bergman as well.
Are you up to it, Jetson? It's going to be a lot of work. Good. Then roll up your sleeves. You'll be working overtime. This is our 5th opening day at the new plant. Jetson better not mess this thing up.
Past all the tragic deaths of cast members, there was one more thing that sealed the fate of the film. The legendary Janet Waldo was the voice of Judy Jetson, George's daughter, in the original series. Janet, of course, can be recognized for her work throughout the industry, from I Love Lucy and The Lucy Show.
You go right ahead and eat your breakfast. Don't let me bother you.
Oh, really, sis? I love that Fotui. And you do too, don't you, Huey?
Oh, I do!
To countless Hanna-Barbera characters, you might know her as Josie of the Pussycats, or Penelope Pitstop of Wacky Races. I've mentioned her on this channel plenty of times. In addition to voicing a robot secretary in the film, Waldo returned to voice her iconic character Judy one final time like the rest of her castmates, and thankfully finished recording the entire movie safely. Unfortunately, her finished performance itself was not safe. Universal Studios executives wanted a big name in the cast to draw in some crowds and bring in more money they felt simple voice actors couldn't. 19-year-old pop star Tiffany Darwish was brought on to re-record over her lines and replace her in the role of Judy, in addition to performing 3 new songs for the film. The recasting was devastating to Waldo, and equally to longtime fans. Andrea Romano heavily disagreed with the decision, saying it broke her heart, and feared the backlash fans might have toward her as the casting director despite not making the choice, so she requested Universal take her name off the film entirely, though she still received the backlash anyway.
Just crying all of a sudden when somebody says to cry, and you're thinking, I'm glad to be here, what's to cry about? But, you know, he was like, bring it, okay, now bring it louder, louder, more and more. After a while, I was bawling.
I'm not making that promise again.
Tiffany sings 3 songs written specifically for this film and says she tried not to feel intimidated by the thought of taking over a role that had been a TV cartoon classic for almost 30 years.
If I wasn't doing a good job, I was hoping somebody would tell me so. That's just the way that I am. If I can't do it, or somebody thinks it's not a good job, you know, just tell me, you know. I'd rather that than somebody pacify me and it's out there and people are going, ooh, you know.
Sort of ironically after that clip, while people liked her song performances, Tiffany's actual acting performance as Judy was panned by critics and audiences who agreed it was extremely poor.
Oh, thanks, Dad. You're intergalactic.
Bizarrely, some of Waldo's performance as Judy still remains throughout the film, likely by mistake.
Wait a minute, Dad! All right!
Yay, Daddy! That's right, George!
You all right?
I think.
It's more than a city. It's their entire world. You're destroying it. And them.
But offers us the chance to hear just a snippet of what she had brought. The film was originally slated for 1989, but Universal feared going up against Disney's The Little Mermaid, All Dogs Go to Heaven, and more, including some of their own films, and pushed it to the summer of 1990 instead. So did pop star Tiffany replacing Janet Waldo pay off? Well, the film opened at number 4 at the box office, making only $5 million, lost 43% of its audience the next weekend where it fell to 10th place, and by the end only made $20.3 million. With the budget and marketing combined, that's pretty much the same amount Universal spent on the film, meaning no profit was seen despite the heartbreaking choice to use stunt casting in favor of a beloved voice actor. Tiffany's star had already faded by this point, so her name at the time ultimately brought no additional value to audiences that just wanted to see the Jetsons. Critics weren't any easier on it, with Roger Ebert putting it at number 2 on his top 10 worst films of 1990, after previously giving it 2 thumbs down and calling it unimaginative. The New York Times called it unappealing to anyone outside of small children. Empire magazine said it wasn't exciting enough, overlong for animation fans, and too childish for live-action devotees. In the decades since, fans have begged for a re-release of the film that features Janet Waldo's original performance in place of Tiffany, but it's not known if such a version exists anymore, and it's unlikely it would ever be released if it did. One thing we can learn from the stunt casting of SCOOB is that some things really never change when it comes to executives and money, and that stunt casting celebrities in favor of voice actors as their recurring characters is a practice that needs to be stopped. Something voice actors now, like the irreplaceable Grey Delisle, who was replaced in SCOOB, hope to see someday. Have you seen Jetsons the movie? For a film that's been called cursed by some, what do you think of the tragedy and troubles that surround the film? And most topically, what do you think of Tiffany replacing Janet Waldo? I know there are many nostalgic for her music in the film, but her acting leaves much to be desired in what could have been a perfect send-off for Waldo in her role like the rest of the cast, leaving many to still wonder why Tiffany wasn't just the singing voice of Judy alone. Alright, let's do the YouTube thing. Like the video, subscribe, follow me on social media, etc. This is 100% a Scooby-Doo focused channel, and breaks for other Hanna-Barbera properties like this will not become the norm, I promise. This is just a bonus. That's the end of it. Bye!